Okay, so we've been talking a lot about arguments, and I've specified that on several occasions we've been discussing deductive arguments. Now, that may have sounded strange because you may have realized from some of the earlier videos that this is actually an inductive logic class. Critical reasoning is generally a reference to an inductive reasoning process, the way we would argue based on probability rather than necessity. So when I say necessity, and we're talking about deductive arguments, deductive argument is good when the premises would necessitate the conclusion. And this is just our definition of validity. An argument is valid if the premises guarantee the conclusion. In other words, it's a necessary relationship. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And any argument that is that way is a deductive argument. But the focus of our class moving forward is going to be on inductive reasoning. And there's a lot of instances where our average everyday thought processes are really more inductive in nature rather than deductive in nature. So the difference is with an inductive argument, the premises support the conclusion by probability rather than by necessity. Okay, we'll probably talk more about that as we move forward. But right now, I just want to identify if we're not dealing with deductive arguments, then do we use the same standards to determine whether arguments are good or bad? Sort of. So let's talk about that for a second. Remember when I mentioned that for a deductive argument to be good, it had to meet two conditions. First, so if we want to have an argument that is good, in other words, an argument whose conclusion should be accepted, an argument that actually takes us somewhere, that does something for us, that once we consider it and evaluate it, we've learned something as a result, or, a good argument will do work for us. So a good argument has to meet two conditions. Really, I'm going to break it down into two condition types. One will be that the premises support the conclusion. The second one is that the premises are true. Now, we've already discussed how to meet that when you're dealing with a deductive argument. If you're dealing with a deductive argument and the premises support the conclusion, you've got a valid argument. Oops, spelled that wrong, V-A-L-I-D. So what makes, or let me say it this way, when a deductive argument is valid, the way that the premises support the conclusion is that they guarantee it. If they're true, the conclusion has to be true, and that comes from the argument's structure or its form. There's a similar concern for inductive arguments, and when the premises support the conclusion by probability, we say that that argument is strong. Still the same concern, that the premises actually give you a reason to accept the conclusion. In a deductive argument, that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. There's a formal relationship between them such that you can't have a false conclusion unless the premises are false when you've got a valid argument. But other arguments that we consider are still rational, even if they're not necessitated by the premises. So for instance, if I told you that 99% of Evangel students are Chiefs fans, and you were wondering if Bob, who's an Evangel student, is a Chiefs fan, the premise that 99% of Evangel students are Chiefs fans provides strong rational support, along with the premise that Bob is an Evangel student, for the conclusion that Bob is a Chiefs fan. It would actually be irrational to assume that he's not, given those two premises. So notice, it's possible that he's not a Chiefs fan, but it's highly probable that he is. So when you've got an inductive argument that you're evaluating, your concern is whether the probability reaches that over 50% to make the conclusion more likely to be true than false, which is sort of a definition of strength. The premises make the conclusion more likely to be true than false. The second concern, whether the premises are true, applies to both argument types, but we use a little bit different terminology. If we're discussing a deductive argument that is both valid and has premises that are true, I'll just put a check mark here, is an argument that is sound. In other words, a good argument that's deductive is a sound argument. Similarly, if you've got an inductive argument which is strong and has true premises, that argument is cogent. Oops. So in large part that's vocabulary, but a little bit different conceptually. Let me make one other distinction here between validity and strength. As I mentioned in the forms and counterexamples conversation, An argument's validity, if it's a deductive argument, gets that from the way that the argument is structured, the way that it's built, its form. You can actually remove the content and test the argument for validity. And if you're in a deductive logic class, that's what we spend most of our time trying to figure out, is how to test arguments for validity. Inductive arguments are not quite so clean. In fact, they're a little bit more messy because you actually have to deal with the content, not just the form. And I'll probably actually move away when we discuss different inductive argument types from referring to the way that they look as their form. You know, we have certain forms that we can name and identify that we studied in the forms section. Similarly, we'll have certain argument types that follow certain patterns, and that functions kind of like a form, but the pattern doesn't guarantee strength. It actually matters what the premises say. But here's the big distinction then. Good arguments, whether they're good depends on whether the premises support the conclusion, whether the premises are true. If we're dealing with a deductive argument, we refer to the support as validity. And then when you've got the whole package, the argument, a good argument is sound. A bad argument would be unsound. A bad inductive argument would be uncogent. A deductive argument which fails to meet this condition would be invalid. An inductive argument which fails to meet this condition will be weak. So those are the terms that we're going to be using going forward, mostly with regard to inductive logic moving forward. And let me know, you might be thinking, well, why did we spend any time talking about deductive logic? I find that often getting a grasp of the conditions for being a good argument is easier when you discuss it in terms of deductive examples because they're so absolute and clear. But now that we'll be moving to inductive arguments, sometimes reasonable people will disagree as to whether the argument is in fact strong. If anybody disagrees about whether a deductive argument is valid, somebody's wrong. But reasonable people can disagree, and sometimes it's hard to tell who's right when determining whether an argument is strong, but we'll get much better at that as the semester goes along.